Hello everyone, and welcome back to Fableheim, the chronological story of Iratus. Today, we have reached a part in the timeline that we know well, the return of Iratus, also known as the events that transpire in the game. Because reading every Humanorium token and zone intro would take a while, I'll instead be squeezing together the vital information for each zone and including one token from each floor that provides some insight into the greater world. Something that will help set the stage for the next video. A millennium after Iratus' defeat and several hundred years after the decline of the living's golden age, the supreme necromancer, by fate, fortune, or something else, finally escapes his imprisonment to renew his war upon life itself. The first obstacle in his path are the vast mines within his own backyard, created by the foolish mortals who dug too deep. Not that they knew what they were doing. After all, the mines are home to criminals and those driven mad through alchemical enhancement. I imagine that Iratus struggled in his initial recreation of his forces. It's not like skeletons and zombies require high-quality parts, but all that Iratus had access to were centuries, perhaps even millennia-old bones strewn about the graveyard, and whatever he could salvage from the alchemically altered criminals. Ironically, the workforce's dependence on these alchemical improvements actually led to Iratus discovering a brand new curse, the Curse of Flesh. War is an eternal mover of progress, especially in the realms of the necromantic. Although Iratus had only recently re-emerged onto the stage, he did not waste any time delving back into his favorite hobby, the creation of minions both dread and vile. In his malefic pursuits, the arch-necromancer had stumbled upon something he did not expect, the power of a new curse, a curse of flesh. Infused into the bodies of those wretched miners by the alchemists and strengthened through sorcerous experiments, their flesh turned out to be infused with so much lingering pain. It took some study, but finally the results are at hand. Their grotesque and putrescent abomination. Undead flesh forced to grow and deform over and over until it becomes a grisly engine of war.
Stitches want to play.
I love Stitches. The mines were directly overseen by a large fish in a small pond, whether that be the keymaster or the mistress, and their overinflated egos were easily stamped out, once Iratus' army was eventually up and running. The first insightful token is the doomsayer. When he was just a wee lad, the doomsayer foretold his parents that the moon will spout tentacles and cleanse the world of both sinners and saints until they provide him with an extra portion of honey-glazed meat. As a teenager, he gave the girl of his dreams a dire warning that only her love for him can stop the ancients from rising up from the depths of the ocean. He later claimed credit for predicting the opening of the Hellgate and the awakening of ancient dragons slumbering beneath the mountains. The last few years turned out to be surprisingly peaceful, however, and he had been considering an early retirement from his illustrious career. But just then the almighty necromancer decided to begin his rise to power, and so it seemed it was time to once again take matters into his own hands. I have a lot of questions, but I suppose my first one is, what exactly is a Hellgate, and, more importantly, is it still open? Asking for a friend. I also cannot help but fathom what monstrous undead Iratus could create with a dragon corpse. Or 12. The dwarven tunnels are the second floor, and home to the true overseers of the mines, the dwarves. Although I say dwarves, the majority of those present are there at the behest of the Alchemist Guild. The Alchemist Guild's largest contract was no doubt with the Grand Magister, and they brought everything they had to ensure their profitability, from their flagstone marksmen to their elite guard, the fire throwers. Along the way, hopeful traders, representatives of the Treasurer's Guild, and some more traditional warriors joined them to stop the return of Iratus. When they were not enough, it was up to the Alchemist Guild's lead inventor or their prime guinea pigs to stop Iratus' further ascent. Their unliving machinery was no doubt a surprise to the supreme necromancer, but it was ultimately little more than an inconvenience. The insightful token of the second floor is the Geomancer, a rarity among dwarves that we have discussed quite a bit. While dwarves are not particularly fond of magic, there are few disciplines that are notably excluded from this stigma. For centuries, geomancers have practiced their craft, proving invaluable to the larger dwarven society in both war and underground construction. There was a time when the geomancers and the alchemist guild were roughly equal in power, but ever since the invention of gunpowder, one seized control and the other was left to grumble and sneakily plot for the day when they would usurp the throne. Of course, the rise of Iratus threw a rather large wrench into their plans. It seems as though the dwarves were not quite as unified as humanity, but with the treasurer and alchemist guilds working together, could the geomancers have truly reclaimed their rightful throne? Not if Iratus has anything to say about it. The halfway point is the mercenary barracks. Prior to Iratus' return, I imagine this place was little more than storage or a staging ground for mining operations, but it is now transformed into a fully operational mercenary melting pot, home to cunning rogues and learned mages, knights and elven rangers, all lambs following the siren call of coin, straight to the butcher. Fun fact, despite what the zone intro says, there are no mages on the third floor. There used to be, during early access when the barracks was the final floor and the pyromancer the final obstacle to overcome. However, these days, the final obstacles are true mercenaries, a cured lycanthropic bounty hunter, or the gimmick boss, the Witcher, Monster Slayer. Both are profound slayers of the undead, but Iratus is undeath itself, and no mere mortal can stop him. The insightful token of the third floor is the Barbarian. These harsh Amazons of the north have fostered many grudges with the more civilized human societies. After all, it was not too long ago that they were freely plundering their merchant caravans in local villages. Eventually, however, a clever merchant got the idea of simply bribing these savage fighters so that they only attack his competitors rather than him. This collusion was eventually uncovered and many other traders tried to join in on the deal, letting the barbarians turn from savage raiders into feared guards and mercenaries that are also easy on the eyes. Beyond the Unfrozen, the barbarian token is the only other time that the North is explicitly mentioned, providing a hint at a society beyond the heart of human territory. After properly thrashing the combined forces of sellswords, Iratus takes his first step into territory under the direct command of the Grand Magister. The catacombs beneath the cathedral. The fourth floor is the Order's forbidden library, where all sorts of dark magic is studied, from blood magic to disease manipulation, and experiments conducted, the majority of which involved the pursuit for immortality. Although well-equipped with tools to fight against mages, I like to think that the Supreme Necromancer, an archmage in his own right, faced no trouble in his conquest of the zone. After all, it's not every day that you come across a ready-made lab filled to the brim with guinea pigs and half-finished research ripe for the picking. The research itself was never meant to leave the underground lab. As such, the final boss of this floor did not exist to protect the mages or their work, but the pyromancer or mad scientist would do their utmost to prevent Iratus from reaching the cathedral to prove their worth to the Grand Magister, who had pulled back his forces and left the mages to fend for themselves. Little did they know the Grand Magister would have most likely rewarded their efforts with death, so Iratus really did them a favor. The insightful token of the catacombs is the Sorceress, a magic caster trained to wield the element of water. Healing magic has always been in ample supply so close to the Cathedral of the Order, yet a great effort was made to train a substantial number of these support mages nevertheless. Someone might have been preparing for a time when the mages would no longer have access to the vast resources of the Grand Magister. The Sorceress token provides one of few glimpses into the greater world of mages, and it seems as if said mages were preparing to stand against the Grand Magister's fantastical ambitions of world domination. After acquiring all he could from mortal research, Iratus finally breaches the surface, finding himself within the cathedral. Established by one of Iratus's beloved foes, this once noble order was meant to be the ultimate guardian against any darkness that would threaten the living world. As such, it was founded on holy power, selfless devotion, and martial prowess. The Order was yet the living world's greatest power, but its purity has been greatly diminished by corruption. Priestesses that once voluntarily devoted themselves to the light were now brainwashed into pure zealotry for the Grand Magister. The Paladin Order, which once bravely stood on the front line against Iratus, was now little more than a mark of prestige, and relics of heavenly might were now nothing more than tools bent to the Magister's will. Despite Undeath's weakness to holy power, Iratus had regained most of his strength by this time. and the corrupted order was nothing before his ire, which had begun to boil over in anticipation of his revenge. Not even the Grand Magister's cheated divinity would deny the supreme necromancer. The insightful token of the cathedral is the Royal Gunner, another fairly recent asset to bolster the military might of the order. The Royal Marksman Corps once answered only to the crown. These days, however, the Grand Magister has a lot more power and control over the kingdom, reducing the king to an almost symbolic position. These shooters are well trained and deadly with their firearms, even though this is one of the few prestigious positions that actually allow commoners into their ranks. This token is the only mention of a human king. Although we can assume there are multiple human societies, I believe this token suggests that the heart of human territory is united under a single kingdom, ruled by this mysterious king who is in turn a puppet for the Grand Magister. After slaughtering a couple thousand armored meat bags, Iratus walked onto the open sky for the first time in millennia. But what he found was not what he expected. A stranger blocked his way, called forth the exalted heroes of the world, and turned a sacred cemetery into the final battleground in the conflict between life and death. Despite its similarity to a necromancer's preferred environment, this cemetery was a hallowed ground of virtue to the humans, and the exalted remains of humanity's very best were the final defense against Iratus. A mockery that the supreme necromancer did not take well. Oddly enough, the summoned opponents, heroes returned in their prime, can all be summed up by a single humanorium token, the dreaded hoplite. Antiquity had many heroes, and although the cultures and civilizations they defended are nothing but memory, they themselves continue to live on in myth. Treated as saints, their remains were eventually brought to this place, where they are now called to life for a final battle against death. With every exalted soul defeated, Iratus's power and ire swelled beyond the days of his prime, until eventually he would reach the final guardians of the living world. The four heroes who dared to stand before him once again. This time, however, history would not repeat itself, and the newly empowered Iratus would claim his ultimate victory.
Well, that was quite fun, but it was merely an appetizer.
The insightful token on the 6th floor is the Plague Doctor. The most recent of heroes to be exalted, those who not only fought against the Great Plague, but tried to resist the Grand Order when it used the chaos to take power. Those were burned as heretics, but a few grateful peasants gathered their remains and hid them here among the holy. Remember when I mentioned research to manipulate diseases on the 4th floor? That information comes from a catacombs quest, where Iratus overtakes a guarded outpost and discovers research into causing and curing illness. I wonder if the plague these selfless souls fought against was not but a power-grabbing scheme of the Grand Magister. With Iratus's beloved foes felled and his shackles broken, the game's story comes to an end. There is nothing more for us to tell. Or is there? Join me next week for the epilogue of the chronological story of Iratus, where I will be utilizing various insights from a number of Humanorium tokens and a healthy dose of imagination to paint the picture of the greater world of Iratus, a world that must now face a fully unleashed Lord of the Dead. Thanks for watching, and a special thanks to the patrons and YouTube members who support the channel. See you next week. Bye!
I am Iratus, Lord of the Dead.